Good afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us today. As Chairman Smith, Staff Director of the Helsinki Commission, I'll make a brief statement, and then Bob Hand, Staff Advisor of the Commission, will introduce our witnesses. This briefing spotlights the current situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's no doubt that Bosnia has made considerable progress in recovering from the brutal conflict that began in early 1992 and lasted until the signing of the Dayton Accords in late 1995. Yet many of the scars of the ethnic cleansing remain with us today. Only 2 weeks ago, the remains of more than 600 victims of the Srebrenica genocide were laid to rest in a memorial service marking the 16th anniversary of that horrific event. Senator Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, the Helsinki Commissioner, paid her respects to these victims as they passed through Sarajevo and marched to Srebrenica. Chairman Smith was in Srebrenica himself in 2007, and I know the experience is one he will never forget. Similar events have commemorated the victims of Omarska and many other atrocities of conflict that, for the survivors, are not so long ago and will never be forgotten. Unfortunately, except for a few locations, and despite efforts to encourage returns, the people of Bosnia remain largely divided along ethnic lines. Government and politics still revolve around ethnic issues. Political parties have been unable to reach agreement on the formation of a new governing coalition at the state level since the October 2010 elections. Some in Bosnia have attempted to move to varying degrees beyond the constitutional compromises that were needed to end the conflict, but which, today, hold the country back. These compromises not only divide the country's population, but hinder the efficient and effective government needed to achieve Euro-Atlantic and European integration. In response to efforts to undertake genuine reform, however, we have seen from many in the political leadership of Bosnia an increase in nationalist rhetoric and unwillingness to work constructively with the representatives of the international community and comments or actions which threaten the country's peace, stability, and territorial integrity. The leaders of the result of the search scale, for example, wishing to maintain their hold on power and approach to go with it, have been particularly recalcitrant in the face of change. The result is that the entire country suffers and falls further behind its neighbors on the road to Europe. Today we will look specifically at the obstacles to progress facing Bosnia today, and perhaps more importantly, at recommendations for the international community. The international community has not only a role to play in getting the country on the right track, but also a responsibility to act. Having acquiesced to aggression and ethnic cleansing and genocide for much of the conflict, the U.S. and Europe cannot simply accept the result we have today. The people of Bosnia and Herzegovina deserve more from their elected officials and from the international community. Now I'll turn the briefing over to Bob Hand of the Commission staff. Bob has over 20 years of experience monitoring and advocating for human rights in the Western Balkans, and he will moderate our briefing.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to join Mark in welcoming you all here. I'd also like to thank my colleague Josh Shapiro in terms of helping with setting up the room. This is far from the perfect room for having a briefing. And we originally entertained the idea of being way up there and then we're all back here, but well, that wasn't going to work too well, and so we had to do some quick thinking. But I think it's worked out. Okay. I'm also glad to see that we have a good audience here. As I remarked to several individuals when they came in, I was a little bit concerned at how many out-of-office messages I got when I was trying to let people know about this. I was promised that many people, whether they're on business or on vacation right at the moment, will be looking at this briefing when it appears on our website. It will be videoed. There is also going to be an official transcript for the briefing, and people who are not here, or I think are here in spirit, and they'll be following up and seeing what was said here today. I'll refrain myself from making substantive comments right here at the beginning. I often will sum things up at the end and may do so at that time. But I think the best thing to do would be to go right to our panel and to hear what it is that they have to say. We've asked each of them to make some brief comments on what they see as the key obstacles to progress Bosnia and Herzegovina today, and also to make some recommendations for the United States, for Europe, and for the international community as a whole in terms of how we should be responding to these obstacles and overcoming them so that Bosnia can move forward along with its neighbors towards NATO or European Union integration as citizens of the country so desire. Our first panelist is Clifford Bond, who has had a very long and productive career as a Foreign Service officer at the State Department. He had first served in the region at the U.S. Embassy to Yugoslavia in Belgrade back in the early 1980s. He then came back to the region from 2001 to 2004 as the U.S. Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And those years were, I believe, some of the more productive years for the country in its post-Dayton recovery. And so he may have some insight in terms of contrasting then and now. Shortly after leaving the embassy in Sarajevo, he actually was a senior advisor on the staff with this Helsinki Commission, where I would say he really became an expert on the Balkans. During that time, we observed elections in Serbia and Macedonia. He led a staff delegation to visit Kosovo during the time of the ULEX deployment, helped to organize a congressional delegation to Bosnia, and he was also put on loan during that time to the Office of the High Representative to be a special envoy focusing on outstanding issues in the Srebrenica region. And so he had a very heavy focus on that in recent years. Currently, he is the Vice President for International Relations at the American University in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we're glad to have you here today. Glad to have you back. Our next panelist is Kurt Bessiner, who I have known for quite a long time. When he first joined the Balkan Institute in the mid-1990s, I believe it was, as a policies analyst. And he has gone on to do many other things since that time, but he's still stuck with the Balkans and stuck with Bosnia, including moving there, about 6-7 years ago, working for the Office of the High Representative, and then working as a senior associate with the Democratization Policy Council, which I believe he helped found. So Kurt is back here in the United States and was willing to take time from his own vacation to come here to Washington to meet with people and participate in this panel. And I'm very, very happy that you're able to be here today. Our final panelist is Nida Jalazis of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She's been there since 2003. I think if we were to have a briefing on any country in Eastern and Central Europe, Nida will be able to participate on a panel as an expert, especially as it relates to the country's aspirations to join the European Union. She been focused very heavily on human rights and political reforms that these countries need to undertake in order to integrate into Europe, and has focused particular attention in recent years on the countries of the Western Balkans and the challenges that they face. She has recently formed a working group on the Western Balkans, which seeks to bring together European and American policymakers and analysts to engage in a dialogue and to collaborate on these issues. And I think much of her presentation will be based on that work. So we've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 5 or 10 minutes, and hopefully that will lead to plenty of time for question and answers, maybe very brief comments from the podium. Although I'm not sure, given the hectic schedule here on the Hill, we may be joined at one point or another by a member of Congress, in which case, depending on how much time they have, we may interrupt the flow just to let them say a few words. But at this point, let me turn it over to the ambassador.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
If you want to turn on your microphone.
All right. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Bob and Mark, and I want to thank the Helsinki Commission too for organizing this briefing. My remarks today will assume a basic understanding of the recent political developments in Bosnia, but if anything's unclear, I'll certainly be happy to answer questions after the presentations. The political situation in Bosnia has been deteriorating for a number of years, but I think it's the worst that I've seen it since I became involved in the country in 2001. Though I don't see any prospect for conflict, neither do I see any ready way out of the current stalemate in the country. With the failure of political parties to form a government more than 9 months after a general election, the country's progress on NATO and EU integration is floundering. The United States has ceded the lead in Bosnia to the European Union. While this makes sense in terms of the process of EU integration, Brussels has a difficulty managing and understanding the politics of the place, and has been far too reactive to crises. The draw of EU membership has been much less effective as an incentive for reform and compromise than it has elsewhere in Eastern Europe. There was speculation earlier this year that the EU was developing a package of sanctions to be used in response to anti-Dayton actions or efforts to block or slow Bosnia's integration into Europe. It was always unclear if an EU member state consensus existed for such tougher measures, and apparently it does not. The US must therefore remain actively involved in Bosnia in full partnership with the EU and its member states. The basic political problem in Bosnia lies deeper than the failure to form a state government, or the marginalization, as many Croats see it, of the two principal Croat parties within the federation, or the recent threat of the Republic of Srpska of an entity referendum on state institutions. These are the symptoms of underlying disagreements about the nature of the state, and these differences have defined conflicting positions on constitutional reform and other political issues. At one end of the spectrum is a vision of Bosnia as a unitary and citizen-based state, and at the other is a loose federation with ethnic-based rights and protections. And I'm afraid discussions of these issues will continue, but the international community must be firm in dealing with obstruction, violations of Dayton, or any threat of dismemberment to the country. At the recent meeting of the Peace Implementation Council, or PIC, the body that supervises the implementation of the Dayton Peace Accords, the international community heavily criticized political leaders for failing to form a state government, but they showed no appetite for intervening directly in the politics of government formation. Party leaders must reach agreement among themselves on this question. It seems clear to me that only a broad coalition that includes the principal Bosniak, Croat, and Serb parties can form such a government. The international community must press party leaders for the earliest possible action along these lines. Some politicians in Bosnia believe that a highly and further decentralized Bosnia can enter the EU. I do not believe such a state structure is compatible with meeting the responsibilities of membership in NATO or the EU. Some basic reforms to improve the functionality of the Dayton state will be essential, but they do not have to result in a centralized or unitary state. But my recommendation to a new state government when it's formed is that it not make constitutional reform a priority. It will take time to restore the trust and confidence that has been squandered over the last 4 or 5 years by political infight before an issue like constitutional reform can be dealt with. A new government coalition should focus on the economy, improving the climate for foreign investment, fighting corruption, and resolving the issue of defense property. The latter will open the way to progress on Bosnia's membership action plan and eventual membership in NATO. This will not only contribute to Bosnia's security and political stability, but also in turn enhance its attractiveness to foreign investors. Once such a track record of cooperation and reduction of tensions is achieved, political leaders can, as they eventually must, turn to constitutional reform. Some of the constitutional proposals made by the US and the EU during the recent Butmir process may be worth reconsidering when that moment comes. I recommend that the EU needs to strengthen its presence in Bosnia. it has recently appointed a new head of mission to its delegation in Sarajevo. His arrival in the country should be speeded up. He is knowledgeable and an able diplomat. He will inherit the title of EU Special Representative. However, he needs to be given real authority over such things as the use of EU resources and policy formulation regarding Bosnia. Currently, the EU delegation is largely a team of technocrats focused on details of the enlargement process. The EU mission staff needs to be beefed up to include analytical and public affairs capabilities so that the mission can play a central role in developing a real European vision and strategy for dealing with Bosnia, as well as have the capacity to implement such a strategy. The alternative will be the least common denominator approach agreed among EU member states, which has characterized policy generated in Brussels to date. Earlier in May, as an incentive to have the RS climb down from the threat of an entity referendum, which was seen by many as a clear violation of Dayton, the EU offered the Republic of Srpska and Bosnia a structured dialogue on the state court and prosecutors. Presumably, the EU intends to discuss the courts and Bosnia's state criminal justice system in terms of EU requirements. The EU should consider broadening that dialogue and using it as an opportunity to educate Bosnian politicians, and in particular the Bosnian public, on what needs to be done institutionally and in terms of constitutional reform to move ahead on the Stabilization Association Agreement with the EU and Bosnia's eventual candidate status to the EU. Subjects such as the need for a state Supreme Court, compliance with a Sejdic-Finci European Court decision on the rights of non-constituent peoples, and a so-called EU clause in the Dayton Constitution, which would give the state a lead in negotiations on enlargement, should all be addressed. For the part of the United States, I recommend that it reconsider an idea that originated here on Capitol Hill just a few years ago. This is the appointment of a special representative or envoy for the Western Balkans. The U.S. team working on Bosnia is extraordinarily dedicated and competent, but a solution of Bosnia's complex political problems will require better coordination, not just between Washington and Brussels, but between Washington and the many EU member state capitals, as well as regional actors like Turkey and Russia. If possible, such an envoy should work in tandem with the European counterpart to develop a more proactive approach in Bosnia. Such a position would be a full-time job, and it cannot be done by someone with broader responsibilities sitting in Washington. I know personally that there is very strong support for this idea among old Bosnian hands, both in the United States and in Europe. I do not underestimate the difficulty of reaching agreement on such issues as government formation and constitutional reform or defense property. But the measures I've outlined can strengthen the hand of the international community as it works to help find solutions on these issues. We need to work to assure Serbs that the ultimate goal of reform is not the elimination of their entity. Assure Bosniaks that reform will produce a more functional and integral Bosnia. And assure Croats that by opening the way to Bosnia's integration into Europe, the position of Croats will be improved and their exodus from the country reversed. I am currently working with a small university in Bosnia. It's a partnership with the State University of New York, Canton. And the university seeks to build a multi-ethnic student body with campuses in Tuzla, Banja Luka, Sarajevo, and Mostar. Its mission is to educate a new generation of students that share a common vision of a Bosnia fully integrated into Europe. Our students, in fact, have met and members of the Helsinki Commission when they visited Bosnia. I think the sooner such a generation can assume positions of leadership in business and government, the sooner Bosnia will be in a position to find political compromises for the longer-term benefit of its citizens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Kirk. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Bob, and it's good to hear you, Cliff. I'm going to follow on some of the points that Ambassador Bob mentioned, but perhaps take a different angle. I think what we're witnessing right now in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and have been for some time, is a deterrence failure that we just haven't paid for yet. The policies that are currently being exercised on both sides of the Atlantic, among the countries in the Peace Implementation Council's steering board, were essentially set in 2005. The assumptions at that time this was sort of the tail end of the period when you were ambassador, Cliff, and Patty Ashton was high representative. And the assumption was that the state building process was so successful and irrevocable, albeit there were some elements that needed to, some unfinished business, constitutional reform and police restructuring, that once the international community could back off. The executive functions of the High Representative and the Chapter 7 military capability that was by that time embodied in U4 but originally exercised by NATO were no longer necessary. And the process of reform could essentially be subcontracted to the European Union and essentially be conflated with the European Union enlargement process. Over the course of 2006, all the assumptions that this was based on were proven false, at least in my opinion, by the election campaign in 2006. Reform ground to a halt, nationalist rhetoric kicked up, and the assumptions that had allowed the progress to proceed in the real state building period from, say, 99 to 2005, but even really all the way back to Dayton, that the country would not be allowed to fall apart, started to be questioned, not just by citizens, but politicians as well. The rules ceased to be enforced. And what we've seen since 2006 is this degeneration of the political situation to essentially a rules-free environment. Legally speaking, the High Representative and U4 remain as empowered as their predecessors were at the signature of the Dayton Agreement, or the bump up with the bond powers in Bonn in 1997. In reality, those powers have been allowed to wither through lack of international political will and lack of strategy. And I'd say the missing ingredient in here has been the United States. There would be protestations to the contrary from the State Department. But it's not just the European Union that's been reactive. The United States has essentially been reactive in subcontracting the European Union. And so essentially what you have now is a divided international community, a divided West that sits in the Peace Implementation Council Steering Board. And the lines were pretty clearly drawn 2 years ago, but they're even more stark now. On one side, you have those who believe that the European Union enlargement process is the only way to go, and that's all the ingredients that are necessary to restabilize and Bosnia and allow for organic progress are there. And those who believe in that are not surprisingly those who sit in Brussels, but also Germany, France, Italy, and surprise, surprise, Russia, which is a big EU cheerleader now, interestingly enough, at least in the Bosnian context. You did call the others camp the skeptics, for lack of a better term. I'd say that the Turks are the most vocal in this group, but the United States not far behind, along with Britain, increasingly Japan, Canada, and sometimes the Netherlands. And so it's about a 50-50 split in terms of raw membership. In terms of European Union membership, it's clearly lopsided in favor of the enlargement Uber-alla scandal. But I think that the argument that somehow OHR, the Office of the High Representative, is getting in the way of EU enlargement processes is something that even the EU itself has abandoned sometimes, but they seem ambivalent about sticking to their point on that. These divisions were made clear in the fight over whether to keep international judges and prosecutors in the state court, organized crime and corruption chamber. And the American vote on that was pivotal and unfortunately went the wrong way. This was in the aftermath of the Bouguer process when I think the perception was that it could be resurrected. And Washington was simply afraid that Dodik would pull out of state institutions if he didn't get it way. Had the American position been different, I think the overall decision would have been different. The High Representative would have felt confident enough to retain them for another 3 years the way he did for the war crimes judges and prosecutors. The Ashton visit really deepened these fissures. The sense here in Washington on May 13th was real anger. I detected at the State Department. I was there just before flying back to Bosnia. That this was a sucker punch. This was something that was not agreed in the big steering board, that the decision had been to support the High Representative in pressing for the full repeal, not only of the referendum, but the 20-odd conclusions that the Republika Srpska Assembly had passed. Those actions visit undercut the High Representative, who is at that time still their European Union Special Representative. And then there was a fight over maintaining the office of the High Representative budget. This was something that was engineered by Brussels with the Republika Srpska without knowledge of the United States, Turkey, Japan, and other members of the PIC. So this caused a lot of bad blood, not just within the building office of the High Representative in the USR, but between the capitals. And the battle, the main point of discussion at the PIC steering board meeting in Sarajevo earlier this month was over Brčko district supervision. Now this is the one trump card, basically, that the United States has via the other members of the Peace Implementation Council steering board, because it's under a supervisory regime. Brčko district is the connective tissue of what any independent Republika Srpska would have to have, at least part of Brčko district, to have be contiguous. And Brčko district status essentially takes it out of the game, but there's nothing to protect it right now. There are no operational troops based there. U4 doesn't have any ability to move troops there except by road quickly. So that would be an obvious place to put a military deterrent. The battle lines there are drawn about as clearly as they are on other measures in the PIC. The continental Europeans and the Russians saying we want Brčko supervision over yesterday. And the fact that Republika Srpska refuses to give assurances that will adhere to the Brčko final award, that's immaterial. There's no legal basis for these. My own view is that until the country is on a self-propelled stable footing and you have an agreed functioning governance system in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I'd say that we should keep that ad infinitum open. And this is an integral part of the 5+2 criteria that were adopted by the PIC steering board for maintaining OHR until these boxes are ticked. Defense property is another one, state property, rule of law, and a unified economic space are the other 5. The 2 are an EU stabilization and association agreement. That box is already ticked, but it hasn't come into force because Bosnia is already not fulfilling its requirements. And the second is sort of the elastic clause, for lack of a better term, which is an assessment by the PIC steering board that things are stable enough to remove the executive guardrails, legally speaking, because effectively they've already become moribund. Now, what I'd like to outline as possible fixes to this. I am among the people that, along with Ambassador Bond, that has advocated a U.S. special envoy to deal with Bosnia. Not so much to deal with Bosnia in Bosnia, but to deal with the international community PIC steering board members about Bosnia. Because essentially there's no strategy. There hasn't been a strategy for 5 years. I would posit the only time there was a strategy was when it was manufactured in Sarajevo in the Ashdown era, and it evaporated when he left. And instead of a strategy, we just have an aspirational sort of bumper sticker that our strategy is European integration. So, one, a special envoy would be very helpful, but I'm going to be a little bit more radical and say, frankly, there's no reason that there can't be an American High Representative at this point. The original deal of Dayton was that the Americans controlled the military element of peace implementation, the Europeans would lead the civilian side. Now the Europeans have a European Union delegation that's going to handle their agenda, and they have the military deterrent. There is no reason that there can't be a non-European, and I would posit American High Representative. Now, the appetite for pursuing that is open to question. I think it's pretty compelling because they are different roles. They're not necessarily out of whack with each other. They can be complementary, but they are different in enforcing the Dayton Peace Agreement and promoting European integration of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I also think that you're not going to have any progress of any kind, be it the economic development that Ambassador Bond mentioned, any reforms, even the low-rent constitutional reform that is stated Finzi, which is important for meeting the terms of that judgment, but functionally won't change a hell of a lot in the way the country's governed. And the problem there is that the Serb and Croat visions of how to implement that are diametrically opposed. And so I don't see any prospect of that being implemented anytime soon. But there won't be any progress until the situation's restabilized and fear is removed from the equation, which has re-entered as a result of the international community essentially stepping back since 2006. So I think the American-led policy needs to be, first, try to develop a consensus, first with the countries that are already basically on side, and then working to try to field Germany or France, whichever is easiest first off, to adopt a policy essentially, so long as Dayton remains the Constitution, you're going to keep the Dayton enforcement mechanisms and we don't have a timeline. That changes the political dynamic considerably, and it changes the calculus for everybody who's playing the game, citizens and politicians included. Then I think you could get some traction from below, from the people who actually want to make the country work. Right now, the political class aren't it. And if we're relying on them to develop a way forward, I think we're going to be waiting a long time and we'll continue this tailspin. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kurt. Linda? You're up.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks a lot for this opportunity to present the work that we've been doing over the last year. As we all know, the United States has supported the European Union's commitment to bring the countries of the former Yugoslavia into the sphere of peace and prosperity through the joint processes of EU and NATO accession. This is no ordinary accession. Compared with post-communist European countries, enthusiasm for further EU enlargement has waned, both within the EU member states and in the Balkans. Also, most of the countries of the former Yugoslavia are less ready than the countries in Central and Eastern Europe in terms of democratic consolidation and institutional capacity, and are unable or less able to meet the demands of EU and NATO accession processes. This shortfall is most evident in Kosovo and Bosnia, where international agencies continue to be strongly involved with the day-to-day politics in those countries. It must be acknowledged, therefore, as a starting point that the idea that the EU accession process can be used as a state-building plan for Bosnia is not the repetition of a successful policy, but a new policy experiment. This fragile experiment requires a strong partnership between the EU, the United States, and other international partners, as well as innovative solutions for addressing the unique hurdles to progress in the countries of the Western Balkans. As Bob mentioned, over the last year, the European Union delegation has supported a project at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which has brought American and European scholars and practitioners together to discuss the obstacles to the EU accession process in Bosnia and the other countries. And my presentation, as Bob mentioned, will summarize the findings and the proposals that resulted from these meetings. This is a brief summary, and I sort of focused the discussion on 4 remedies. But a larger version of all of these policy briefs is available outside, and also on a website that's dedicated to these issues, which will also have the forthcoming policy briefs from the meetings that we're having this year. So let me begin with the 4 remedies. The first is something that both Bob and Kurt mentioned, is to manage the perceptions of the EU-US policy in Bosnia. The second is to strengthen policy coordination so that the EU and the US have a shared policy, even if they do different things to forward that policy. Third, there should be a focus on small-scale policy goals attached to clear incentives in order to move the process along, albeit slowly, but this is something that has worked in the past in the visa liberalization policy, and we should try to emulate that and further, in going further. And fourth, the EU and the US should engage directly with civil society groups to help meet these reform goals in the region. We should also work with other international actors in also dividing up the labor in this joint policy. Let me elaborate on all of those points now. Since the second half of 2009, European and American policies towards the Western Balkans seem to enjoy a higher level of harmony. Rhetorically, at least, there is unequivocal agreement on both sides of the Atlantic that Bosnia will be a member of the European Union once it meets its conditions. EU membership, the thinking goes, will end the unhappy chapter of the violent demise of Yugoslavia by bringing the countries into a secure, democratic, and prosperous Europe. But in Bosnia today, there's a large gap between the vision for Bosnia that the US and the EU share and the perceptions of this policy on the ground. These misperceptions are as much the result of simple misunderstandings about the complex EU process as they are actively constructed narratives created by political leaders to redirect the reform agenda. There is no more obvious example of this gap than the recent anger expressed towards the EU and by the Federation because EU leaders have made visits to Banja Luka rather than dealing solely with Sarajevo. They've accused the EU of negotiating with Republika Srpska for enlargement separately. And even American analysts in Washington have repeated this false claim, which has led to a deepening of frustration with the EU and fears that the EU's goal is actually to break up the state. These fears would be understandable. After all, breaking up the territory of Bosnia would violate the Dayton Accords and would be tantamount to reopening all of the territorial disagreements that started the war. However, a closer look at the EU accession process reveals that these fears are unfounded. In the EU accession process, negotiations refer to a very specific stage in the accession process. It happens after a country becomes a candidate and before they become a member. If you look at, as a point of comparison, Croatia has just recently completed its negotiations with the EU. Bosnia, by contrast, isn't even a candidate yet, so it cannot enter into negotiations for accession. The people in the USR in Sarajevo have said that the SAA provides a reason for the EU officials to directly work with the Republika Srpska. This was agreed on in 2008 in the SAA. So there's nothing sort of unusual or secretive going on here. Moreover, EU officials have repeatedly said that Bosnia must enter as it is now, as one state. In Bosnia, these misunderstandings become toxic, polluting not only the relationship between the ethnic groups, but also between the EU and the entities, as well as the EU and the US partnership. So the first step in our sort of remedying the policy should be that we should have an assumption of goodwill between the EU and the US. For Americans, that means that we must make sure that our information about the EU's processes and motivations is correct. And second, by working with civil society and with journalists, the EU and the US should manage perceptions about our policy goals, and thereby help to ensure that the political agenda in the country remains on track. There's also confusion in Bosnia about whether the EU accession is a goal or a process. It is actually both. EU accession is a process that leads to the goal of membership. But in the Western Balkans, and especially in Bosnia, focusing solely on EU as a goal creates a binary system in which seems to place the responsibility for enlargement not on the state that's trying to get into the EU, but actually on the EU itself. This perspective also gives the EU a reactive rather than proactive position, as it simply waits to judge the events that are going on in the region and compare with the norms of the EU. Therefore, in order for the goal of EU accession to be a remedy for Bosnia, we must put a greater focus on the process rather than on the end of accession of membership. When accession is seen as a process, the many steps involved in this accession can be presented as a menu of activities that are compatible with the goal of EU membership. To become more proactive, the EU and US partnership must extend beyond simply supportive speeches. Rhetorical partnership is a clear improvement, but the current parallel policies may not be sufficient to change the political dynamic in Bosnia. Rather, the EU and the US must link their policies in order to compound their power. These joint policies should not focus on large-scale changes, such as getting into the EU or a wholesale constitutional change, but on doable small-scale reforms that are directly linked to the EU acquis communautaire, which is the body of laws that make up the legal sphere of the EU. So I added a little aside that this is because it's the acquis communautaire, because they are already agreed upon directives of the EU, that would alleviate the problem that Cliff mentioned on the lowest common denominator. All EU member states have adopted these. They're clear markers for the accession process, and that's something that we should use the things that bind us for the policy as it moves forward. The small-scale method has been successfully tested in the EU's visa liberalization policy. So going forward, we should reproduce three elements of the visa liberalization policy. First, the limited scope of reforms. a strong civil society support, and sort of an instant benefit once those reforms are adopted. I've already mentioned the menu of options that the EU directives provide, and that should be the source of those policy reforms. In the last meeting of the working group, we focused on sort of a crisis of legitimacy in the Western Balkans and in Bosnia. Especially in Bosnia, it seems that elections are the only test of legitimacy, which creates a myriad of problems. Because the stakes are so high at elections, electoral results can be contested, as they were in Albania recently. And in Bosnia, even though after parties succeed in winning elections, they seem to forget about the responsibilities that are attached to their office. And the failure of forming a government over the last 9 months seems to be a clear example of this. Almost everywhere in the region, it seems as though the promise of personal gain or judicial protection associated with political office is the primary motivation to enter politics. In such an environment, elected leaders have not taken their responsibility for being responsive to citizens' interests, let alone make a serious effort at meeting EU accession criteria. Civil society activists routinely run into walls of undemocratic and unresponsive institutions in Bosnia, just as the EU and the US have done in their attempts to promote reforms. Therefore, the EU and the US should partner with civil society in order to exert pressure both from above and below on intransigent politicians. This won't be an easy policy change to make, since the EU accession is primarily, or has been primarily, an elite-driven process, and the traditional role of civil society is simply to elect pro-EU parties. In Bosnia, as I mentioned, voting will not be sufficient, because even though there is near unanimous support for EU accession, politicians routinely choose to put symbolic political goals above the accession reform agenda. To bring political leaders back to the EU path, the EU and the US should engage directly with civil society groups by demonstrating how the adoption of EU norms can help them to reach their own goals, whether it is through access to educational opportunities in EU countries, higher standards for women's rights, better labor law practices, safety standards for products, sustainable energy management, or any of the other issues that EU directives may impact upon. By organizing the seemingly insurmountable pile of directives as limited public policy choices, a sort of stairway emerges so that leaders in the Western Balkans can follow. Informing civil society, engaging with them in this process will be essential. I'd like to underscore that rather than simply support the EU initiatives, the United States should link its policy to that of the EU, which it hasn't done to date. The EU and the US partnership should also invite participation by individual EU member states, which have their own foreign policy capacity, multinational institutions such as the OSCE and the World Bank, and other actors, large foundations, in order to strengthen the policy and divide the labor among this complex group. That's the only way forward as I see it, and as the working group has seen it, to address the complex issues in Bosnia and the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nida. Before we go to the question and answer period, it's somewhat traditional here at the Helsinki Commission that we allow a representative of the country that we're focusing on at a particular hearing or briefing to be able to say a few words. And we have here in the audience Damir Janko, who's the charge d'affaires at the Bosnian Embassy. So I'll ask Damir if he would like to make a few comments, and then we'll open the podium up for questions.
Bob, thank you very much. First of all, I would like indeed to thank the Helsinki Commission and Mr. Miloš and Bob Hane for organizing this conference and briefing about Bosnia, although it's not always easy to sit on the occasions when they're talking about my country. I would not go to make any comments on what the distinguished speaker said, or that privately I fully support what they're saying, but I would like to emphasize that your effort and your work to try to keep United States focus and interest more on Bosnia is, I think, indeed very much valuable, and it's crucial for the faster path of Bosnia for the EU and NATO membership. So in that regard, I am offering my cooperation fully for any further activities, and hopefully we will be witness of the successful finish. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor to questions from the audience. I think I'll first turn to my colleague Mark to see if he would like to ask a question. In the meantime, if there's somebody out there who would also like to ask a question, please come up to the podium and be ready to ask your question. Mark?
Thank you, Bob. I do have one. Maybe I'll work in two questions here. Chairman Smith has been interested in and involved in Bosnian affairs for a long time, back to the 1990s. And he's been very vocal about the kinds of reforms he would like to see in Bosnia. That is, he supports a constitutional reform that would make Bosnia into a country where one person, one vote. There will no longer be entity blocks to political action. He's also known Haris Salajic, the former Bosnian member of the presidency and the leader of the party Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he also knows Bakir Izetbegovic, the Bosnian member of the presidency from the Party for Democratic Action. He considers them both to be very good people. Obviously, this is politics, and you can disagree with what they want to do politically. And I don't imagine Congressman agree with everything they want to do. But I would very much like to hear from our panelists what we might expect different from a Bosniak member of the presidency, Bakir Izetbegovic, as opposed to Mr. Salajic. There's been a lot of, there's a sort of gloss on it right now, but the difference is largely one of tone and approach, although the goals of Mr. Izetbegovic are very similar to those of Haris Salajic. I'm not happy if you agree on that. There may be some substantive differences that you're beginning to see signs of, and how that might play out.
Let me say something, then I think let me say something in response to that, and then I'm sure Kurt, who's been following the situation on the ground, has thoughts. We have to deal with the Bosnia we have, not the Bosnia we want. Sometimes Mr. Salajic had a strong vision of what he wanted in Bosnia, which did not really conform to the reality on the ground. And his campaign as a politician to eliminate the entity of the RS, to talk about unitary state, though couched in special language, drove the Serbs away. I think Bakir Izetbegovic understands you have to not just put pressure on them, you've got to draw them into this project that is Bosnia. So I think that's a big difference. I go to that period of reform people referred to, 2001 to 2004-05, when we were making progress in a number of areas, military, taxes, customs, border service. And it came about with general recognition that people wanted to get Bosnia into the EU, that they probably had to change and build institutions to be able to accomplish that. But that development wasn't accompanied by rhetoric about the destruction of the entity, about changing the Constitution to remove some of these institutional protections, like 3 members of the presidency, like the entity veto, like a House of Peoples, an upper house of representation is based on ethnicity. Those are there because there's real distrust among the communities. And until that confidence is recovered, you're not going to be able to go as far as some people would like to go in terms of one man, one vote. That would be my response to it.
Kurt, would you like that?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a little bit. I mean, I largely concur with Ambassador Bond about the differentiation between Salajic and Izetbegovic is largely one of tone, but tone is very important. But I think the big difference between now and say 2005, I mean, when the constitutional question was opened, then that inherently that was coupled with the perceived retrenchment in American engagement. I mean, it was seen, at least on the ground, because I was there, as a 10th anniversary present dating anniversary present to ourselves, over to you, Bosnia, over to you, we're out. And that opens, the perception on the part of many Bosniaks and Croats. I mean, there was definitely political opportunism shooting down the April package. But there was also genuine fear that this is the only shot we have and is this good enough, because then they're going to walk away. And there was unity from Republika Srpska, from the three main parties there, saying this far and no further. After that, you can perform the federation as much as you like, but we're done. And I think that in terms of the sort of Bosnia that Selajic was the worst spokesperson for the sort of Bosnia he said he'd want. I mean, he was so radioactive in Republika Srpska that it didn't help when he said 100% BIH. It was interpreted as I want to dominate 100% of BIH. That's a losing message. But unfortunately, nobody's really stepped into the breach to try to sell a different sort of Bosnia beyond their own constituency very effectively. And I think that's going to be, that's the hurdle that needs to be cleared. Right now, the policy environment is very, I think it's impossible to do that until, without some external stabilization. I don't see that as something that could be changed internally, because the incentives are all wrong for that. There are incentives for why people behave the way they do. It's not that they're irrational, they're behaving rationally within that system.
I do want to add something. I would defer to Cliff and Kurt about the personalities of the politicians and what to expect from them. But I'd like to point out this is one of the main differences between the EU and the US of how they sort of conduct foreign policy. The EU accession process is designed not to care who is in charge of the country, not to care which political party is driving the process, but that process is going forward. In Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of the in many countries, the parties that were the leaders of EU-focused reforms were actually the reformed communist parties. They were the ones that American politicians were a little allergic to after that long the Cold War and their experience, but the EU was able to sort of overcome those political differences and focus on simply what is being done and what is being accomplished. Of course, in Bosnia, it's a little different. You do have to sort of focus on the politics on the ground. And this is, I think, an opportunity for the EU and the US to cooperate and to collaborate and combine their styles of foreign policy. But I think it should be acknowledged that this is sort of a very different way of looking at things.
Okay, thank you. Mark, would you like to follow up or ask another question?
Yes, thank you. This is rather different, but it's a concern I've heard before. I think it's quite interesting. Has there been any talk of Northern Ireland and the peace process there as a model for Bosnia and Herzegovina? I see several similarities. The police reform was a major issue in Northern Ireland, and police reform has been on the table also in Bosnia. I think of people divided chiefly by religious faith, and they're all from the same place, what marks the different nations here is not so much what we usually call nationality, but religion. I wonder if Ireland has seen this as they're engaged, or any of the British politicians who were involved in the Irish peace process.
Would like to start with that?
I'll just make a quick comment. Patty Ashdown frequently drew this comparison. But he drew it to make the point that it took tens of years in Northern Ireland before you established a peace process. And that we were pushing Bosnia in less than a generation to recover from the war. So I guess the point he was making is there are similarities, there are lessons that can be learned, but the process in Ireland went on for a very, very long time. And it was remarkable how much was accomplished in Bosnia in so short a period after the time.
I would add that I agree with you on Ashdown. I mean, having worked for him, this was the point that we make quite frequently. Look how far along we are via how long it took to do Northern Ireland. And there are quite a few Irish academics as well who were informed by that and sort of got interested. But in terms of as being a topic of regular policy discussion or extrapolation of lessons from one to the other, my own view is that quite often that's overdone, and I don't hear that much of it on the ground.
Yeah, I would agree that it's helpful and informative, but also not sort of used every day. I think there are countless examples of how many countries in Europe have dealt with both ethnic divisions and religious divisions. There are also bad counterexamples, like the example that the experience that the EU has had with Cyprus, that they're trying to avoid. But I think that and the whole project of the EU is about overcoming those big differences, whether they be ethnic, whether they be religious, and focusing on those shared values and commonalities, and building institutions and norms that will bind them. I think the problem is that the EU has a big cloud over it right now. It's got other problems, just as the US has big problems, especially with the economic crisis. And the EU is forgetting the narrative that brought it together. When the EU and the US forget the reasons for the founding of the European Union, how can we possibly try to export it to a country such as Bosnia? So I think we need to sort of go back to remembering, not idealizing the EU, but remembering what brought us to this place and why the EU accession is an essential element in the policy in Bosnia.
Thank you.
Did you want to say something more, Kurt?
I just wanted to say that the EU often forgets that the security element of the equation was largely removed from that allowed the European Union, the healing project, of the peace building project that was the EU to go forward, starting when it did. And I think that security and deterrence are terms you don't hear the EU use. It's not a soft power term. And soft power, at least from Brussels' perspective, is we're not nasty, we don't beat up on people like the Americans do. I'm being very facetious about this, but I think that's basically a subtitle in their own minds. And so the security element, to be honest with you, I've heard people say, well, Bosnia must be stable because we gave it a stabilization and association agreement. It must be stable. They don't want to question it. And I think that element really cripples them in assessing the ground reality of what they have to deal with, which is not to say they can't succeed, but they're going to have to approach their own checklist in a more creative way than they've done if they want to.
Okay, thank you.
If I could follow up a little bit here, I was thinking about while you were answering the question, maybe I hadn't asked it quite right. I was pretty much struck in the Irish case by the fact that you had a dissimilarity, that you had a Northern Ireland police force, what's it called again?
Royal Ulster Constabulary.
Yeah, you see have been deeply complicit in crimes of many Protestant paramilitaries, and there you have also Serb police who were complicit, so many of them in genocide. And that's really a striking parallel, and the need to create a new police force that everyone can trust. Really a striking parallel, and I would think that there will be a place there for engagement of the members of the new, what's the name of the police force?
There is no
In Northern Ireland, the police service of Northern Ireland. Anyway, thank you. I want to follow up on that particular.
Let's go to questions from the audience. Who would like to ask a question? So you're in first. Please come up to the podium. If you could first state your name and your affiliation, and then if you're directing it to the entire panel or just one individual. There's also paper up there if you want to write your name and affiliation as well, so that when we transcribe the proceedings, we can get your name correctly. Or you can leave a card there, that would be fine too. And I think the microphone is on, so just...
I'm Zvon Kolavas, Executive Vice President of National Federation for Croatian America. We have been very active here for Croatia and Croatians everywhere, including Bosnia. I just want to make a short comment. Ambassador mentioned marginalization of Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't want to, we all know about it, especially I don't want to mention Serbia. Most of Croats are out of Serbia anyway. Now it seems the Croats are marginalized by Bosnia in Bosnian entities. I just want to warn everyone that if Croatians are not given equal rights as the smallest group of the three in Bosnia and Herzegovina and are pushed out, you will end up with two opposite poles that will God not keep together, Bosnians and Serbs. So we contend that the Croats and equal rights of the smallest group and could be the only glue that will keep Bosnia and Herzegovina as a feasible country.
Would any of the panelists like to react to this comment? Kurt?
Just very quickly, I think the bottom line on what will constitute a functioning Bosnian state is quite simple, which is not to say it's easy to arrive at. It's very hard to arrive at. But the concoction is simple. A critical mass of each self-defined group of people, and that's more than three. That's what state deficiency is all about. There are a lot of people who don't want to fit into those boxes because of mixed marriages, because there's a Habsburg inheritance of small communities of Ukrainians and Ruthenians and what have you. They all need to feel that they can pursue and protect their interests in whatever the state structure is. That's the bottom line. My own view, which makes this even harder to arrive at, is that so long as Bosnia is ethno-territorially divided, it's living on borrowed time, and it will have to be externally buttressed. That's the reality as I see it. And the alternative is a lot worse. Alternative is pursuit of unfulfilled agendas that ultimately lead to violence. And I'm less sanguine than Ambassador Bogdan about the possibility of that, which is not to say that people are champing at the bit to do it, but right now there's no fire break. Essentially, there are no guardrails because the security has to be ensured from without. I do think, for example, Milorad Dodik means what he says. He wants independence and he's going to take his time to pursue it. Violence doesn't work for him, but it might not be up to him. And there's been a remarkable lack of violence since the war 16 years ago, given the amount of ordnance floating around and amount of real grievance. But we have to remember it wasn't a groundswell that brought the war. It took a lot of engineering to destroy Bosnia and Herzegovina. It wasn't something that just happened one day. And so prevention of that is something that is very cost effective considering the alternative, and it allows for that formula to be pursued. Either process-wise over the long term, which I think is a realistic prospect, but you're not going to even start with the first step of that progress until that's assured, from my perspective.
I just add that Bosnia as a concept includes Croats. That's the identity of the country, part of the identity of the country. And the best way to secure a better situation for Croats is to get Bosnia into the EU. That will create economic conditions and hopefully political conditions, which will make it an attractive society for Croats to remain in, maybe even draw some people back from Croatia, many who left at the time of the war. So I think movement on EU integration and things like NATO are very important. That's why this distraction of forming a government and the infighting that's been caused, which slows down this process of integration, is very damaging to Croats as well as Bosniaks and the Serbs.
Thank you for your question. I think that there should be no doubt that every group in Bosnia needs to be represented in the government. Every group needs to have remedies in courts. Every group needs to be able to make an impact on policy as the country develops further. But I think there are many ways for groups to be heard. I think today in the current institutional structure, it's true that most groups don't get a voice. Essentially, there are a couple of political parties that make all the decisions, and even people within the same ethnic group don't have a say in what that government does. So I would suggest, I also would caution that, like Kurt said, this idea of territorial redistribution, which creating a Croat entity would entail, is like sort of bringing the conversation back to the 90s, to that territorial redistribution that caused the war. So I would suggest there are many ways of making sure and ensuring that groups are represented in institutions. And I would urge you to look for institutional solutions rather than territorial solutions moving forward. Only because this will enable you, if it's a co-op group, to find. I mean, there's diversity within that ethnicity as well that can reach out to groups in the Bosniak and the Serb community to find ways of moving forward on specific issues. And that's what I talked about when I said sort of small-scale reforms targeting students, targeting women. And in this way, people can sort of learn how to ask for democratic institutions to be responsive and together build a state that will, take its place in the European nation.
Just quick answer. I was
Okay.
not
Could you
recommending.
come up to the podium, because it's being transcribed?
I was not recommending the territorial division. What I am recommending is to make sure the marginalization of the Croats stops and the Croats receive back equal political rights. I'm not questioning methods. I'm not questioning situation. The people will decide, and people that are working will decide how and what. But right now, Croatians are being pushed out. And once you come down, before the war, there were 820,000 Croatians in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Today, it's less than 500,000. Once you reach the numbers of 200,000, 250,000 Croats, they'll be completely marginalized. They will have no work in political system. And then you will end up with two polarized ends in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Not even European Union, nor United States, nor God will keep them together. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. If I could ask, it's a different question, but somewhat related, is the involvement of Bosnia's two neighbors, Serbia and Croatia, in developments in Bosnia today. Both of those countries effectively were signatories to the Dayton Agreement. They both have engaged in considerable reconciliation between each other. In the last year or so, we saw President Tadic make a visit to Sarajevo earlier this month, and I think just recently in Brioni, there was a summit of the presidencies of all three countries. Is this just symbolic? Is it also having some effect on the ground? If you could, I think I would probably direct this mostly to Kurt, but for any of you who would want to comment on how constructive Serbia and Croatia are in trying to support Bosnia and to get it moving forward with them as they all seek to be integrated into Europe.
I think that it's hit or miss, frankly, but I would say the negatives, the atmospherics and the imagery is more positive than the reality. I think Bosnia has both Serbia and Croatia more involved in its internal politics than it has ever since Dayton, certainly since they've undergone their democratic transitions in 2000. And I would say that this is an aggregate negative. They're filling a vacuum. And I think the mixed messages of the international community do not help in this. I mean, for example, Croatia's been given green light for the EU, even though it's got border disputes with Bosnia and Herzegovina that are not resolved. I mean, that's supposed to be something, one of the boxes you have to tick before you get into the EU or NATO. It's swept under the rug. Serbia has some too, but in Serbia is also much more deeply engaged in Bosnian politics. I'd say Croatia is a relative newcomer to the game since Mesic left the presidency, and particularly since the elections. I think that quite often it's just lazy lack of strategic policy on the part of Washington, Brussels, and the other capitals in Europe to assume that so long as Croatia and Serbia are moving forward, Bosnia will move along the slipstream and everything will be cool. No, not so. In fact, I'd posit the reverse. So long as Bosnia is unstable, and so long as this is an open question, those capitals, it has the capacity to drag the democratization and political development of Serbia and Croatia backwards. Because while nationalism is much more visible in Serbia and Croatia in the sort of reconstructed pre-2000 form, but it's there in both. And I worry that so long as these questions remain open and the EU and NATO and Washington don't stick to their guns and make sure that standards remain standards, and that we stick to our own standards, which we quite often avoid. We sidestep them when they're inconvenient to try to create momentum and the illusion of progress. And then we delude ourselves into the progress that we manufactured and believing is real in the hope that it'll be followed by a real thing, and it never is. The message taken on the ground is that we could fake them out. We could have our way. Why should we move to the EU when the EU will move to us? And so I think it could be positive if the messages were clear and consistent from the clubs they want to join. I mean, Croatia's already in NATO. That's already out of the barn, but they're not yet in the EU. That still has to be ratified. And so I think that could be a net positive, but only under certain conditions. It's not automatically a good thing.
Nina or Cliff, would you like to add something?
I don't disagree with what Kurt said. My impression, though, is that, well, recently there has been involvement in Bosnian internal affairs by Zagreb and Belgrade. It's much improved than the situation was earlier. They both, Zagreb and Belgrade, have to look to their nationalist right. And that sometimes drives politicians to use rhetoric or to get involved, as apparently Zagreb is doing now with the failure of the government, the conclusion of the rights and positions they want in a state government to get involved, and to other people inside Bosnia to object to it. But I think it's much improved. There's always room for improvement, but it's better than it was some time ago.
Yeah, I agree. I think you should also remember that no one symbolic thing will fix the problem of regional integration. It's an ongoing process. It will continue. And I think that the EU ought to engage in region-focused policies as well, so that the countries can continue doing what they have been doing, which is sharing information on the EU accession process. Serbia and Croatia in particular have exchanged a lot of information on this process, and I think that even if it's a lower level, not at the highest level of politics, that sort of information exchange between technocrats and countries is very helpful. And all of it contributes to creating a unity in the region and making it possible to imagine a future where they're all in the EU.
Thank you. Next question?
I'm Cynthia Eford. I'm the Senior State Representative Advisor on the Helsinki Commission. And I guess this is for Ambassador Bond, but also for the others. It's, of course, positive that university students can get together. But when I was recently in Bosnia, we were talking about the segregation of education at the elementary and higher level, secondary level. And it was quite clear that the OSCE efforts to ameliorate the situation were strongly opposed by political leaders who claim to be acting on behalf of parents. And of course, the danger is that means that the next generation is being formed with an even worse impression of the other ethnic groups than their parents had. And I just wondered what could be done by the international community to increase integrated education at the secondary and elementary school level, and is there a specific role for the OSCE now that their current effort seems to have been failing? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say a few things to that. Yes, you're right. I mean, yes, you're right. Education is segregated in Bosnia at the elementary school level, where there are buildings in which students share classrooms. The students are divided by nationality. Their curriculum is different in areas like literature, some politics, That's why I'm attracted to this little university that I'm working in, because they are trying to develop multicultural. Universities are largely monoethnic as well, because of the ethnic cleansing as a result of the war. And in Mostar, where there's a large Bosniak and Croat community, they have separate universities. With resources at hand, I think there's limits to what the OSCE can do. I think it's, in some respects, tried to confront this thing head on, and it's produced polarization where people fear that their children are being driven into the same classroom as resistance. I think there's more that might be done in terms of curriculum development, so that even if they are in different classrooms, at least they've got shared history, shared culture, some knowledge of each other's literature, because it's common Bosnian literature. I think exchanges are extremely important. You're right. My fear too is that we're creating a new generation of people that have not had a lot of experience dealing with other ethnic groups and think of them as different. Don't realize how many commonalities they have. We had someone at the embassy who sent her child to a camp that was being organized, I think it was by an American program, brought Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs together. The child was surprised that everybody was speaking the same language and communicating so well with each other. So, you know, it's just anecdotal, but yeah, it's a fear. I think we may be in a position to do student exchanges, bring students together, civil society things that can work to break down those sort of barriers.
Kurt,
I just want to add to that. I mean, the problem here is a political problem. I mean, the reason this has been such a tough nut to crack is because it's the life support system for the political class. I mean, let's face it, there are only about 10,000 winners of the war, and they're all the ones driving the black Audis, and everybody else lost. Some people admit it to themselves more readily than others. And that doesn't mean, but they can still keep people divided through fear, and it's very easy to generate that when you inculcate it very early. And what you're facing now is at least the potential. I mean, there are some amazing young people who do color outside the lines, but you have to be more of a nonconformist to cross those barriers than you used to, because there are very few opportunities to confront your prejudices and find out they're irrational on a daily basis than there were before 1992. And this was one of the issues that frankly fell through the cracks of the international community. It got handed off to the OSCE. The OSCE didn't have any authority outside going back to the High Representative and saying, can you crack the whip with so-and-so? And since the whip isn't being cracked about anything, even dissolution of the state, it's not going to be cracked over education. And so that is, so long as the perception is that this is acceptable, and the EU doesn't really deal with primary and secondary education. It's not part of the acquis, so there's no leverage there either below the tertiary higher education level. So it's a real problem. The problem is a political one. I mean, you'll find some amazing people who are willing to really cross boundaries, but they are outside the norm simply because the boundaries are already set and they work within them.
Just add, yeah, it's political, but sometimes internationals, foreigners, see that these people speak the same language, they come from the same gene pool, they're really the same. Well, people don't feel that necessarily in Bosnia. They do feel a sense of identity, ethnic identity, cultural identity. So that has to be respected. Then you work to, lessen those sense of differences in areas, as I suggested, curriculum development, exchanges, bringing people together, and that can work. It can work. It's working in the Soviet University. They get together when a congressional delegation comes through, and the congressmen and women want to speak with English-speaking young people to get a fresh sort of voice on what's going on in the country. So I think there are many ways we can get at it. We definitely touched on a very, very important problem.
Did you want to add something?
Just to say that thank you for the question and for bringing up that issue. I think that points to sort of the reason why the EU and the US really need to focus on a new policy. there's no muddling through. There's no sort of allowing or getting Croatia and Serbia in and waiting until the rest of the region sort of follows through. I think waiting and not doing things will just exacerbate exactly the problems that we raise. So I hope that a stronger engagement will follow.
Okay, thank you. Next question?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mike Jades from the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'd like to congratulate you for calling attention to the need to address Bosnia because of the deterioration that's taking place. We often talk about the need for conflict prevention. This is clearly a case where prudent and wise action at this stage can help to prevent things from deteriorating to the point where violent conflict might potentially reemerge. And your panelists should be congratulated for some very clear recommendations. I would divide them into two categories, top-down and bottom-up. My question's going to be about bottom-up. The top-down is a lot clearer to me. Special envoy, U.S. Special representative, the need for the EU and the U.S. to coordinate their efforts, make them more coherent, come up with a strategy. The bottom-up part is civil society. And I'd really like to get more clarity on what that would mean and how you would operationalize that. Who's going to do it? This is somewhat self-serving because the U.S. Institute of Peace does engage with civil society. Kurt knows this since he worked with us for many years. But what is it that's needed and who should do it? And of course, civil society evolves sometimes it evolves very quickly, but sometimes it's also very glacial. So what can we do that would be catalytic and then create a synergy between the top-down and the bottom-up?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very important one. Who would like to start with the answer?
I think Nina's going to have a lot of suggestions, but just one thing.
Okay,
because
okay.
Yeah, just one thing that we were talking earlier before the panel started. I do think there's a need to get issues out into the public domain in Bosnia, in civic society, get them discussed. It's too easy for politicians to manipulate the dialogue by using a few buzzwords and by presenting any argument as a threat to one particular group. I've always thought if we could find a way to bring people together in sort of discussion groups, moderated on a single issue, explain it, get their thoughts on it, I would suggest bringing groups together that have similar interests. People who are lawyers, people who are students, doctors, people who have a common link there. That's not just, you're getting more than just an ethnic explanation or an ethnic reaction. Tape it, if possible, edit it, and then broadcast it as sort of a show that would be entertaining to the public. There are many, many media outlets now, electronic media outlets in Bosnia, and I think some of them would be willing to pick up some of these issues, especially if they're well edited and well moderated, and you could find that would go a long way to educate the public. And you know, it would help fight this ability of politicians at a very high level defining what the issue is and what the choices are for people, and give them a chance to voice, you know, their common concerns.
Thank you, Bob. I would, there's a very long, or a much longer policy brief specifically on civil society that's in this package that I organized, but let me try to think, summarize it for you. I think one of the things that came up in our last meeting when we talked about the legitimacy in the Western Balkans is that NGOs that are seen as sort of puppets of the West aren't trusted for the same reason that other, that international institutions, including the EU, are sort of suspect because they don't feel like they addressed the problems that arose in the 90s adequately or fairly. They don't feel like justice is being served. So there is still a lot of tension between the international community and civil society in the Western Balkans and at large, and especially in Bosnia. So one of the things that we thought of that would help alleviate that dissonance is to ensure that first of all, we should conduct civil society promotion. We should fund them through USAID, through the EU is already doing that. Individual EU member states and their various foundations are doing that. international foundations such as Soros Foundation is doing that. We should support that. We should also support groups that come up internally with ideas for how to move forward, rather than sort of dictating to them what needs to be done, because they understand the culture, they understand their ideas, and I think that there is a frustration in civil society. We see that in the polls about how much trust Bosnians put in government institutions. There's a frustration with not being able to make an impact on government, and I think that's a very valuable amount of energy that the international community should lock into and support. We should also bring them in, as I said in my initial address, we should bring them into the EU enlargement process. It's not easy for the EU to do this, and it may be that the U.S. could take that role of sort of translating EU policies and norms to civil society and engaging with them individually wherever sort of an interest comes up. If the interest is in women's rights, absolutely, let's support that, and let's look at EU directives to sort of, and other EU initiatives and other EU member states to sort of drive and dictate how that ought to be done. So sort of building on things that already exist, supporting them financially, I think that they definitely need that. Also, I wanted to mention there was a conference in Bosnia that some of us attended, I think Kurt was there, that was organized by my council at CITES. And there was a panel there specifically on civil society, and they wrote a joint agreement to cooperate with each other and to move forward on EU accession. And I think there are some websites where they're posting some of their ideas. So I can share that with you. Maybe we can add that to the briefing once I get that information.
Sure, that would be fine. Did you want to say something?
Yes, I did actually. I mean, I think catalyst is the right term, Mike, and there are a few things on this. I mean, one, the prevailing assumption in this whole discussion is that we're dealing with a representative democratic political elite, which I think we have to deconstruct that from the very beginning. Bosnia is not a functioning democracy in the way the EU's used to dealing with the enlargement process. You have three stovepipe political universes, and the people and the politicians who operate within that don't have to try to attract votes from without those sort of built-in constituencies. So there's an inherent, it would be as if we only had primary elections, which is starting to seem like the reality, and you never had to try to attract swing voters or independents. So there's no incentive to compromise. There's no incentive to be reasonable. And frankly, they've got a pretty good deal as it stands. Enlargement doesn't hold many more fruits than they already got. I mean, visa liberalization, to use an example we used, the reason that moved, not only was it relatively easy, no oxes were being gored on their part, and it was something that was very tangible to the average citizen. For most people prior to that, EU enlargement meant finally being able to get out of the box and travel like they used to before the war. But that was the main problem, is that I don't think it translates to some of the much more difficult issues. I don't think you can extrapolate from that very easily. The EU's been tone deaf. America's been tone deaf too, but the EU has a special problem because the EU has been an elite project. And constituency building is not something that they think they need to do. They assume that when they're dealing with an interlocutor from a wannabe member state, they assume they're dealing with democratic political interlocutors that are willing to do the heavy lifting to join their club, and they have a social political consensus behind them. That's not the case in Bosnia. So they have to sort of recalibrate their whole approach. Bottom up, top down, I mean, you put the people in the middle. That's the reality. I mean, people at the bottom rung, politicians in the middle, and the international communities at the top. Once upon a time, politicians were looking up. They were afraid of getting removed. They were afraid of sanctions. They're not afraid of that anymore. It's a happy hunting ground now. But they're also not afraid of their constituents, because they don't have to be. There are two tools that they can use, patronage and fear. And fear is a hell of a lot more salient than it was 5 years ago. Patronage maybe less so, but still potent enough. I'll give a concrete example of the sort of thing that could be done that could give a leg up to self-generating civil society rather than grant-eating civil society. That you put out a request for proposals and people say, oh yeah, we can do that. And there's a lot of that, not just in Bosnia. The priorities of of the capitals drive the priorities of civil society. So they're disconnected, they're not really civil society, they're an NGO class. Before the election, and this is something I tried to encourage the European Union to do, or the Commission to be more specific, they didn't want to do it because they didn't want to get involved in politics. I said, okay, go issue by issue. Go through your own checklist of SA. You said in 2006 that Bosnia needed an agriculture ministry, for example. Now, Bosnia's negotiated a stabilization association agreement with the EU, but the Bosnian farmers do not have market access to the EU because they don't have an agriculture ministry and a state food safety bureau to certify their products are safe. Who does this hurt most? Obviously, Bosnian farmers. But which farmers more than others? The ones in Krajina. They've got the best farmland, they're closest to the EU markets. They're predominantly in Republika Srpska. The RS is the reason there's no agriculture ministry, because state competences are evil, right? So that would have been connecting those dots, spelling out how much it cost in Kenya and Fenega, would have been a stick that could have been used very effectively before the October elections. And if they went through the checklist issue by issue, sector by sector, nobody's ox would not have been gored because everybody's protecting some kind of racket. And citizens would have actually got the idea, wow, the EU actually cares about us, not just its partners in the elite set. And it would have given people who had these constituencies that you mentioned, the farmers are one of them, definitely, who have a common interest, and they've recognized it before. They tried to mobilize in 2005, 2006, it never went anywhere. But something to work with. And I think that sort of analysis that would be politically trenchant would be very helpful for them, and then give them the wherewithal if they come up with an idea to use it to pursue that.
Okay, thank you. If I could ask one question to each of you, so 3 questions altogether, and whereas I'll direct my questions to one of the panelists, you can all chime in if you feel like making a comment on the other questions. If I could first start with Nida. The ambassador made a comment about the EU sanctions that they were potentially going to use against those politicians in Bosnia who opposed Dayton. And correct me, Cliff, if I'm wrong, but you didn't seem very positive on the ability of the EU to actually carry this out.
It was something that was under discussion. It doesn't seem to have developed. It doesn't seem to have been support for it.
I was wondering, Nida, if you could comment on this. Do you believe that had Mr. Dodig proceeded with the referendum or tried to go take it further steps, that the EU would have gotten its backbone up and taken stronger action? Or is this something that they just thought up and it's just sort of on paper that gets shuffled around the capitals and doesn't actually mean very much? If I could then ask Kurt, he had mentioned, I think more than the other panelists, the Sejdic-Finci case. If you could elaborate that on a little bit more. I mean, it clearly is something where the European Court of Human Rights has ruled in their favor. It's clearly something that needs to be changed. What are the obstacles to actually getting that change? And I think you had commented that it was, sort of not a major issue compared to some of the other things we're addressing, but doesn't it have quite a symbolic effect in terms of what it says about ethnicity as defining who participates in the political life of the country, that could have some fairly significant reverberations when you do start talking about constitutional reform in a broader sense. So if you could comment a little bit on that. And then, Cliff, I'm glad that you mentioned the issue of the U.S. envoy. That is something that I have supported here in my work as well. I know the House of Representatives passed a resolution in the last Congress, I believe, H.R. 171, which called for a U.S. envoy to be appointed. But let me be a little bit of a devil's advocate on that, Cliff, and ask you to elaborate a little bit on the U.S. approach to Bosnia under this administration. We have to admit, we have had a lot of high-level visits. The Vice President, the Secretary of State, I believe Bosnia is number 2 or 3 on the list of countries that the Deputy Secretary has visited. There's been a whole lot of high-level attention paid to Bosnia, not just Bosnia, to the region. But there's not a whole lot really to show for it, from what I can see. I was wondering if you could elaborate what's wrong. Is it only symbolism, that there's nothing backing it up, that people at a high level come and they say things, but it's forgotten the next day? If you could elaborate a little bit on what an envoy would do. I think you mentioned it a little bit, or maybe Kurt did, in terms of working with the Europeans more and things like that. Things that an envoy could do that we don't see currently happening with this administration, even though there does seem to be a lot of high-level interest in supporting Bosnia. So those are my 3 questions, and again, if the person I asked them to could maybe take the lead in responding, but you can all sort of chime in as you want. And in the meantime, I'd like for the next person to raise their hand to ask the question.
Okay, I guess I'll start with the sanctions. I have no idea what Catherine Ashton said to Nobody when she visited, and I think that may be part of the problem, that it's not as transparent as we would like. If it was more transparent, the U.S. government could help if they want. We should also not assume sort of bad. Again, I wanted to mention about the goodwill that we should assume from the EU. I think people in Washington were hurt about, when they heard that Ashton sort of took this on herself to end this. I think there is, mounting evidence that there are some political leaders in Bosnia that are enriching themselves, and that this information could be brought to light. Maybe that would be, maybe that was something that was used to convince Dodik not to move forward with the referendum. We won't know. But I would hope that the EU and the US could cooperate on the future with Paris as well as Sticks. And if the EU, which for many reasons I think doesn't want to seem like they're compelling or holding a gun to Bosnia's head to create reforms, since that's not something that the EU wants to do, maybe when necessary, this is where the US could step in. And that's what I was hoping to get at sort of this burden sharing, this joint policy between the EU and the US. If they coordinate their policies better, they might get what they want without having necessarily to reap or they could reap the benefits without actually having to have suffer the costs of those policies. So,
Kurt?
I just want to chime in on that real quick. I mean, there's certainly no necessary contradiction, and in fact, quite a lot of potential synergy between the American, European, and other interested actors in Bosnia and Herzegovina outside the PIC steering board. Actually, the main donors to Bosnia and Herzegovina are outside, or many of the donors are not represented in the PIC steering board: Norway, Sweden, Switzerland. And many of the members of the PIC steering board, aside from the United States, have effectively checked out as major donors. But I don't think the Ashton episode was a misunderstanding, or at least its fundamental misunderstanding. I mean, if there was to be coordination, the understanding the Americans had was that we were going to go into this together and deal with the referendum question. And so the fact that was done without prior consultation or done, the Queen was informed hours before she went to Banja Luka. I mean, that was the problem. And it was seen as, the EU acting on behalf of the full PIC without consulting the full PIC, and that was the problem. One other point on, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, I'll pass it to Cliff. Sorry.
I just add on the Ashton agreement, yes, it ended a confrontation, but it didn't solve the problem. The RS, the Republika Srpska, still believes it has the legal right to use referenda to challenge state institutions. And there are a whole row of state institutions that they've set up like ducks that they want to shoot at. And they include the value and the VAT and indirect taxation service, the customs service, the central bank, the state investigation and protection agency. These are all critical state institution. So it may not have resolved the problem, it just may have put it off.
Okay.
I remember now.
Okay, go ahead, Kurt.
Just very, very quickly. What I think showed very clear disconnect, though, which I don't think could be attributed to simply misunderstanding or bad timing, was the fight over the OHR budget that happened immediately after the Ashton visit. And this was an attempt essentially by the European Union to unilaterally cut the OHR budget, and they were aiming specifically at the areas that Cliff just mentioned: rule of law, virtue district, the single economic space, by targeting particular departments. And so that contributes to a lack of sense of common endeavor. Finally, on the EU instruments, I mean, the EU has been talking about these restrictive measures, is the terminology they use, and according to the white paper that they published on this, this is visa bans, asset freezes, and ability to stop EU funding mechanisms. The only restrictive measure, by my reading on this, is actually on the EU head delegation, because the EU special representative, Insko, could have done this, could have raised this with the members of the EU, the Council, but ultimately had to decide whether to put these into place. Already, what this new mechanism does is it adds a step. It ensures that there has to be commonality among the EU heads of mission within Sarajevo before it ever gets to Brussels. So it gives one more opportunity for the weakest link in the chain to object and kill it. So it's not going to intimidate anybody.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we go back to Cliff to focus it now on the U.S. policy and the U.S. envoy issue versus the high-level attention that Bosnia has received thus far, and then we go back down the line to Kurt and Nida, and then we'll go to Kurt to focus on the Sejdic-Finci.
Well, the idea of an envoy or representative for me is not, as Kurt said, it's not to replace an ambassador in Sarajevo. It's not to replace someone in a position in the State Department currently. It's to provide some sort of coordination with all of the players that have influence on the situation on the ground in Bosnia. And you're right, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Dutch are doing a lot of assistance. A lot can be done to coordinate with them on the civil society initiatives, for example. We are, as people use the word here, reactive, just as the EU is. We need to be coordinating with people as a problem develops and speak coherently and jointly about it. If the EU gave a counterpart to an American, such an American envoy, that would improve the coordination that everybody's talking about. We'd be sharing information with each other. Now, I can see why some people in Brussels would not want the Americans in their knickers in EU capitals. But it would improve. I mean, the way the EU works, for me, and need to be in a better position, it regularly discusses these issues with all of its member states and produces a policy that has the full support of all of them. You need unanimity, and it produces the slowest common denominator. Nobody sticks their neck out. It's the reason why I would like to see the EU delegation on the ground be given a lot more authority, take a lot more initiative. I mean, you had that period of a burst of reforms in 2001, 2004, because the reforms were being generated inside OHR with the support of the international community. It was happening on the ground. Too often, people come from Brussels, they parachute in, as Ashton did when she was negotiating with Dodik, and they don't really know what the situation is on the ground. And so I think we would produce more consistent policy, more coordinated policy, I know that the position of the administration right now is that they don't see the need for it. But you point out we have had a lot of engagement. It hasn't produced any results. What are we going to do different?
Just following that, I mean, I agree completely, but I'll get into a little more gory detail on the mechanics. I mean, the reality is that the member states make the EU policy, except when they don't care, and then the bureaucrats make the EU policy. I think we have a combination of both right now. That the policy toward Bosnia and Herzegovina is primarily bureaucratically driven because it's enlargement driven. Now there's a process, there's a checklist, it's bureaucratized. And I think the prevailing assumption and hope is that they can just plug and play and they don't have to learn anything because they've already figured it all out, which is not working. There's also fatigue, frankly. I mean, You see this with the EU military force, which is hollowed out. Its mandated strength is 2,000. It's down to about 1,300 now with the withdrawal of the Irish contingent, and the Germans are reducing what little they had left. So it's predominantly Austrian, Turkish, Hungarian, and a few Bulgarians who do base security at Butmir. That's it. And this is essentially people are checking out unilaterally. These decisions are not being made collectively. These decisions are being made on the fly by individual member state capitals. And what it's leading to is essentially an abeyance of any sense of rules or limits. A U.S. Special Envoy or a U.S. High Representative, so anyway, a single, a connective node, if you will, is necessary because you can't do this with a long screwdriver. You can't just do it with periodic episodic visits and phone calls. There needs to be somebody whose full-time job is to be the sheepdog of the Western members of the PIC. Let me give you a concrete example of how that could work. I mentioned the International Judges and Prosecutors decision that was in December 2009. The delineation was the countries I mentioned. Had the American position been different, it would be otherwise. But you could pick any issue you like. What's ultimately going to matter, the center of gravity of the EU is Germany. Right now, I think the United States actually has more equities with the French than we've had at any point because of Libya in recent history. And frankly, the French are less politically invested in what's going on in Bosnia. They care less, so a policy pivot is going to hurt them less than Germany, which is invested more. But those two have to be brought on side. The Italians will come along, and then you could drag the bureaucracy, and the Russians will have to decide what to do. But it doesn't start to turn unless the Americans initiated that process. So you need a special envoy or an American high rep to do that. That's the only what's going to happen.
Thank you. Nina?
Thanks. I'll take a different position. I wonder, I guess what I've been observing over the last few years is sort of a paradigm shift, or an attempt at a paradigm shift. For years, the U.S. was the driver of policy in the Western Balkans, and especially in Bosnia. We had a very close relationship with Bosnia. We had an interest to sort of preserve what we had started, and we were the drivers. I think the paradigm shift that we're attempting is that the EU becomes the driver of that policy. I think that it might have been ham-handed, the attempts to block the OHR's budget, but I think in sort of raising the status of the EUSR, the OHR needs to be at a lower status. I think that there needs to be one voice in Bosnia, not only for the EU, but also for this EU and US partnership, that a sort of a stronger EUSR could provide. I mean, why not have the EUSR be, this the sheepdog that you were talking about? The EUSR is, they might not have convinced you in the past, but maybe this new EUSR will be able to do it. So I think we might give that a chance to work. A special envoy in the U.S. Could help focus the debate here, but I would hope that special envoy would simply echo what the EUSR has to say. Maybe that's the reason the State Department thinks that they've got it covered.
Okay, thank you. And then Savage Quincy, Kurt, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I know that both my colleagues will have something to say on this as well. I mean, this is something that everybody saw coming for a very long time. I mean, this goes back to the Venice Commission's opinion in 2005. That there's discrimination on two particular offices in the government structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The presidency, where there's a representative of Bosniaks, Croats, Serbs. The Bosniak and the Croat are elected within the federation, and citizens can vote for whoever they want. In Republika Srpska, you citizens, no matter what they want, have to vote for a Serb. You have to be one of these groups. Now, there's no ethnicity police, so you get some interesting people claiming to be one group or the other. But the two plaintiffs or claimants in this, Dervo Sedic is a Roma, and Jakob Finci is a Jew, a Sephardic Jew. And both of them said, well, wait, I'm a citizen of this country and I can't be elected president. There's something wrong with this system. And they took the case to the European Court of Human Rights in December 2009 and finally won. The other office is the House of Peoples. This has 5 representatives of each community, each of the constituent peoples, but again, you find the problem, where do they fit in? The hard part of this is how you implement it. I mean, and this is why I mentioned the Serb and Croat political leaderships being, despite their recent comedy, are not on the same wavelength at all, because the RS position is remove the ethnic label, because we know a Serb's going to get elected from RS anyway, that's a given. So we're not risking anything. The HTZs have said, well, wait a minute, we're already having a problem with Bosniak votes electing the Croat members of the presidency, even though he's Croat, he's from the SDP, so they don't see him, they claim he's not a legitimate representative of their view. And so this is just going to dig that hole deeper. I mean, the only way they don't state it outright as much, but the only way you really get around that is by a territorial constituency. So you have the representatives derived from an area, and then you could do it through the same House of Peoples. Where would you put the others in the House of Peoples if there's a territorial element and they're spread throughout the country? I haven't heard any convincing arguments on how to deal with that. There are varying views on how to deal with the presidency. Do you add a 4th member? I mean, so you could end up potentially with a country even less functional than the current model to comply with this ruling. Now, yes, there's a potential ripple effect. I mean, definitely, you're finally complying with the Council of Europe requirements that have long been flouted. But the reason I wasn't downcast on the importance of this, but unfortunately, now constitutional reform as a concept has been reduced to this thing that doesn't affect the functionality of the state at all. And that's what worries me, is that this will be a box-ticking exercise in a lot of places to say, yes, great, we've got progress, and in the hope that momentum will be generated from it, and I just don't see it.
I'd like to link this question with what we talked about civil society. I think the way forward, I think Kurt explained it very well. The way forward is not simply to say, okay, let those 3 parties decide on something that they can agree upon, but rather we should bring in civil society to actually discuss these things. I think the issue that the court and the Council of Europe have something to offer Bosnia should be made. That there are human rights norms that have been adopted by European countries because they had these problems before. They solved these problems by adopting their political structures to these human rights norms, and they've succeeded. They've largely succeeded, and this is sort of an opportunity for the international community to engage with civil society, to do constitutional reform, not in a closed door, but in the political society, and that should be the way forward, and to be able to avoid those problems of sort of creating an even more complicated system. The EU reports are full of sort of admonitions that the Bosnian political system needs to become more coherent and streamlined, and that should be taken into account when the reform that to comply with state issue decision takes place.
Just a comment, I think it's been explained, but the irony is that the Dayton Constitution, which includes these violations of the European Convention on Human Rights, was supported by European countries who were already signatories to the convention. The problem with addressing the case is that the Serbs would like to do the minimum. Most of the other groups, the 2 other groups, would like to do more. This is just one small part of Constitution. And they refuse to just take this small step without some accompanying larger steps that address the question of functionality. And that's why it's sort of stalemated.
Okay. Is there another question in the audience? If not, I know that Mark has one. Mark?
Thank you, Bob. For what I guess probably be our last question here, I'd like to give you a bird's eye view of the Bosnian conundrums as we're dealing with them here. Yeah, a bird's eye view, certainly also a layman's view, but I don't think it's not, what I have to say is completely idiosyncratic. It's probably in many minds fairly widely held. It seems, looking at the situation, bird's eye view, from 35,000 feet, that both sides basically have each other in check. That is, the Serbs have the Bosniaks and Croats in a situation where they can't create a unitary one-person, one-vote state. And the Bosniaks have the Serbs in a position where they can't secede or create an autonomous republic, completely autonomous within Bosnia. So the situation where we're each in check, but neither one of us can move forward to checkmate is one that's also very unsatisfactory to both sides. So I asked myself, well, so what happens next? It seems there are two possibilities. Either you could have a vigorous push from outside to rearrange the board such that something could happen, or it could just go on indefinitely in the Dayton arrangement. To give a kind of conclusive judgment on it, again, this is of course my judgment, a layman's judgment. I'm sure it's open to lots of criticisms, but I don't think we really want to go forward with the current situation indefinitely, because of course nothing remains the same indefinitely. Things change, and when things would eventually change, if we go out with the current situations just roll on, it would probably change because things have gotten worse, and change would not be, we'd be dealing with bigger problems. So if we come back to this question of an outside push, we're really talking about two candidates, the EU or the US, I think. To certain, no one's a push from Russia on this. We're talking about the EU and the US. I don't think we're going to get a push from the EU, which brings us back to the US and the question is it possible, conceivable, advisable, desirable to have a strong, vigorous push from the U.S. government to move both sides, to move this negotiation forward in some way that would bring it to a conclusion in a way that would create a one-person, one-vote unitary state. And I'm sure there are problems with this as well. But from my point of view, this is at least somewhat, in many respects, desirable. I'd like to hear from you. Is there any energy moving in this direction, or is this a direction, or is opinion maybe moving, as far as you can perceive it, on Buggy Bottom or among opinion makers in general in Washington who are going to decide this question? That would be the big question. But following up on that, and of course it may be going in the opposite direction, what might be preventing it? We're very concerned about Bosnia here, but of course it's a big world, and maybe this is just the kind of solution I'm talking about is prevented by, well, the reset with Russia, or relations with Turkey, or we've already consigned this to the EU, and our relations with the EU are more important than what would happen if taking something back. Or maybe it's just something simple like, this is just a terrible problem and nobody wants to be responsible for it because nobody's busy to solve it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And finally, an action item. I think this commission is supposed to be about action. And Chairman Smith is the chairman of the Bosnia caucus. There's the question of whether Congress should, and the Bosnia caucus here would be a leader re-engage on Bosnian questions, expressing its views to the department. I imagine I'll get some strong views from some of you certainly, but and maybe from all of you. Please.
Cliff, would you like to start with that?
Not really.
Okay.
Well, people have discussed, I'm sorry. People on the panel here, and you folks have discussed some ways of changing the dynamic. I think direct confrontation is not the way to go. As you said, the RS can block any constitutional change if it doesn't agree with it. They have to be brought along. From my mind, that means constitutional change in Bosnia is going to have to be limited and gradual. And it can only be done if you build up confidence among the three communities. Coming in with a big hammer, I don't think would necessarily be helpful. The Bootmere process, they didn't use a big hammer, but they offered them a very good deal. The EU and the US set out some constitutional reforms, which, as I say, were limited. They didn't address some of the deal breakers, like entity voting, but it did do some specific things to improve the functionality of the state. And it was rejected. I think we have to work to change the political dynamic there, change the way the people think about it, change the loyalties some voters have for some politicians who are obstructionists. The EU has to do a better job of selling what it is that needs to be done. And the things that need to be done don't need to do away with the entity. They're more modest than that. And we have to do a better job of selling why integration in NATO and the EU is so important. So that's sort of where I come. And then I make a comment. I don't sense that there is any appetite in the international community right now to come in and use a big hammer or try and do a Dayton 2 or whatever to negotiate a new constitution for the country.
Kurt?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be realistic or honest about what the international community can and can't do. The solution, any solution that's going to stick is going to have to be organic. It's going to have to be something that citizens of the country, however they identify themselves, whatever their identity is, buy into. And if a majority of one community doesn't buy into it, then you're stuck. You have to go back to the drawing board and tweak it until they can. But the international community controls can affect the context in which these people approach this problem. I mean, I'm actually a very frustrated optimist and not a pessimist about Bosnia. The only referendum I'd love to see, frankly, is what I call the Goli-Otok referendum, which is if you ask any Bosnian, would you like to send all your political leaders to Goli-Otok, which was a prison island Tito sent the Cominternist to in 1948, 4 out of 5 would say, yeah. There's no love for the political class in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They're all pretty despised universally. That's something to work with from a civil society perspective. And I think holding the rein is what we can do. We can say, gee, if you love the Dayton Constitution because you've seen this transmutation from 1996 to now, where in 1996, Dayton was a dirty word in the Republic of Serbia. It was spat out with venom. It was something that they saw as preventing the unification of RS with Serbia. Now they're Dayton fundamentalists. They've gone from Dayton rejectionism to Dayton fundamentalism in 15 years. The obvious retort is if you love Dayton, you better learn to love the enforcement mechanisms of Dayton, which are Annex 10. That's the high rep, and that's U4. And we can hang out. That doesn't have an expiration date. And that changes the context completely if it's believed. And that's the problem. We have a credibility deficit in Bosnia now. The international community's credibility has never been as low as it is now. And that's something that is remediable. You can change it. But it's going to take American leadership to change it. It doesn't mean American confrontation with the European Union. And it's not just America and the EU, it's Turkey, it's Japan, it's Canada, it's pig steering board, and ultimately it's Russia too. But Russia has been an opportunistic scavenger in all of this. They get to pick fights with the West and stick their finger in our eye because it's free. They don't have to expend any political capital to be a pain. If they did, they might operate differently because they don't have any real interests on the scoreboard right now, other than economic, and those would be safe pretty much with anybody. I don't think that's not the main argument you hear from within the Federation. So I think establishing that context would allow those citizens who want to get traction to get it. I don't think an internationally devised deal is a good idea because it won't stick. I think what's standing in the way of preventing a more concerted or strategic American engagement, I I think it's just in the too hard box on people's desks. I mean, there are residual elements. I think that we don't want to be seen to pick a fight with the EU in their own backyard. I understand that. This isn't something that in public confrontation would be good. Confrontation isn't the way to go. But I think there is a recognition on the part of member states of the EU, and even lesser extent of the EU bureaucracy, because they have more vested in the policy pivot, or against the policy pivot, that this isn't working. We need to try something else. And not just continue trucking on bureaucratic autopilot, which is where we are now. So I don't think the added effort is all. I think an incremental added effort with more focus would deliver a lot of results if you have a designated hitter to deal with it, and that could be a special envoy, that could be a high rep. But this person needs to have access to the top, and he or she's going to need to call on it to get Berlin, Paris to move. And then you can get Brussels to move. Unless that happens, it won't shift.
Okay, Lena, you can have the last word with the panelists.
Thank you, Mark. I think there is still an appetite for working on Bosnia in Foggy Bottom and throughout Washington, as you see from us today. There have been many attempts, sort of large-scale attempts to do constitutional reform, and I think all of us in the EU and the US would have, been grateful if they would have worked, but they have failed so far. So now the idea is to shift the focus between sort of the large projects that have been easily scuttled by the rival political factors on the ground, and moving to sort of smaller scale issues, engaging with civil society to make sure that it's harder for that one political party to undermine the rival policy, and to create greater transparency. I think we're looking at a longer time frame than just a couple of months of Big Bang reforms, and I think we sort of come to terms with that. The National Endowment for Democracy organized a conference last fall that Kurt was part of also, that looked at ways of engaging the newly elected leaders in changing the way that changing the dynamic of the constitutional reform process. And now we've been waiting for them to form a government so that we could start that. So I don't think that there's a lack of appetite. I think there's a lot of interesting parties, a lot of good ideas that still haven't been tried, and I hope that one of them works.
Okay. Thank you. Before turning it over to Mark to close this briefing, we're running a little bit behind. I'd like to personally thank each of the panelists for their presentation. On Thursday, in the same room at 1:30, our commission is having a hearing on U.S. policy towards the OSCE. That hearing usually, traditionally, also includes U.S. policy to the various countries of the OSCE that are of concern. So maybe some of the issues that have come up here today can find their way into that hearing. We will have Assistant Secretary Gordon, Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, as well as the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Michael Posner, and from the Defense Department, Assistant Secretary Vershkow. And so I think that would be an opportunity to maybe raise some of these issues, because overall the sense that I get coming away from this briefing is there's a lot of goodwill towards Bosnia. There's maybe not enough political will, and we need to focus a little bit on that and see if there is a too hard box, and see if we can pull some things out of there and put it in the must be done box. And I think that's part of the role that Congress plays in the U.S. foreign policy process, is to try to encourage that kind of debate and show some support that could actually help the administration maybe move forward on things that might be tough to do. So with that, I'd like again to thank our panelists and thank my colleagues who have helped put this together, and the audience for coming and listening to me talk as much as I have and asking questions. And I'll turn it over to Mark to end the briefing.
Well, I think we've taken care of most of the thank yous. Thanks only to Bob Hand for the wonderful work, and also to John Shapiro for the wonderful work on the hearing. With that, I don't have a gavel. We're adjourned.